Welcome back. This is week 14, lecture 2, A Brave New World. And this lecture is the last really lecture of the course. If you look at the introduction, you'll see, or look at the slides, the PowerPoint slides, you'll see the introduction, I think for the first time, has a subtitle, So What? And that question, so what, is often how I end my courses with a lecture with the title, So What? Because I think it's important to take stock and look back when we get to the end of a course to see where we've been, what we've gone through and accomplished, and what relevance it has for us today. Your first discussion was what is history? And history is something that is a problem. It's not simply the past or what happened. It is our entire development that has led to being who we are today and the developments that have led to the world in which we find ourselves today. So I think that is important no matter what course I teach to make that jump, because as I also have argued that history is not a thing of the past, it is always a thing of the present. So it's important to pose that question, the so what question. But the title for this lecture, A Brave New World, is not mine. It is taken from the title of Aldous Huxley's novel, A Brave New World, which was published in 1932. Now, Huxley's A Brave New World is a dystopian, futuristic novel. It's not a pretty picture. It depicts a world where human beings are produced in laboratories, kind of the end of family life. And so there's issues of thought control, and it's not a world I think any of us would want to live in. But the question I want to pose is to what extent, not that the development of Western civilization until 2024 has been fulfilling Huxley's vision, but to what extent is it a brave new world? There's all these traditions in the Western tradition, anyway, of always progress. We're always progressing. We're always getting better and better and better and better, onwards and upwards. And yet at the same time, always in history, there's been the opposite view of, and we're all going to hell. It was better back then. If only we could get back to where we used to be. The Golden Age myth, which has been there from the very beginnings, basically, as opposed to, oh, but yet we're better than we ever have been. How do those two myths fit together? Now, this lecture 2 is, when I say it's substantive, it is, but it's basically reflective. It is my reflections, not as an individual, but as an historian, on the development of Western civilization, or whatever it is that we term Western civilization, from its origins until the present day. Now, this is Western Civilization 2, but that is also based on Western Civilization 1. And so how have we gotten to the situation we're in? So this is not my attempt to tell you where we are. This is not my attempt to say my view and vision of the world is the correct one, and I want you to learn it, and that is that. It is more of an attempt to share with you my own observations as an historian, posing questions, looking at the present in light of the historical developments that we've seen and talked about in this course. So that's kind of the overall arching frame, I hope, for this lecture. And then we'll focus in the next lecture in week 15 specifically and more practically on the final exam itself, even though I think this lecture certainly contributes to that. As I'll talk about next week. Now, that being said, where have we come? What is the state that we're in right now? After looking at the developments of Western civilization to this point, what do we see? And to what extent are we on a brink of a new paradigm? And is that new paradigm an improvement? Is it a disintegration? And really, as I will talk about several times probably during the course of this lecture, the question I think we must pose is, has Western civilization developed to the point that it has undermined itself, and that we need to go beyond even the concept of Western civilization? And what does that mean for us? Now, we go to the first slide. We have the US, the EU, again, or the European Union, versus Russia, China, and North Korea. If you've been paying any attention to the news and the real news, I'll be talking about disinformation later, and I'll be talking about news media later. You are aware of the situation in terms of the opposition and potential conflict or tensions between Europe or the EU with the US, NATO, and then Russia, China, North Korea. It's not to say that Russia, China, and North Korea are all one and the same, certainly not, but they're allied. Just as it's not to say that the EU and the US are one and the same, but we're allied. So we have these two kind of great alliances. Now, it wasn't very long ago in the lectures I talked about the end of the Cold War, or post-Cold War Europe, post-Cold War Western civilization. The question here is, have we ever gotten really beyond that? So the wall falls. Okay, the Soviet Union disbanded and was disintegrated. And it seemed as if the United States remained as the sole superpower, so to speak. Is that the case now? Or was it simply a kind of a phase within an ongoing Cold War? A Cold War between two ideologies, between two views of what it means to be human. And if that's so, is that an indication that this conflict, whether we call it the Cold War, whether we call it the ideological struggle, the great ideological struggle between these two opposing positions, which are ideologies, are we on the brink of our own destruction on both sides? Or can one side emerge victorious over the other? And what would that mean? What would that look like? How do we solve this conflict? If we said, okay, the Western view, i.e. the United States and the EU, is the right one, and that is going to eventually win out, as it did in the course of the 80s and 90s and the end of the Cold War, what would the world look like? Or, if that is not the case, if the other position of Russia, China, North Korea, if they win out, what would that look like for us? What is at stake in the competing of these two ideologies? Or do they have to be in conflict? Is there any way that they can harmonize? Those are some of the questions that face us today as we are sitting right here, right now. What direction do we go? How do we approach this conflict and problem, and on what basis, for what purpose? Are not both sides, so to speak, simply trying to provide the best for their citizens, for their people? Is it an issue of power? Is it an issue of resources? Is it an issue of ideologies, of ideas, of saying we are right with our idea? No, we are right with our idea. And how is that ever solved or resolved except with conflict? And would the conflict that might break out in terms of not a Cold War, but a hot war, so to speak, be the beginnings of our own self-destruction? We have new rumblings and rumors and talks of potential nuclear war. We have problems internally and externally. And we're not in necessarily a good state if we look at the state of the quote-unquote the West. We have poverty, increasing poverty, as well as increasing wealth. The poverty gap continues. And this is especially evident or clear, let's say, with the development of the UK, the United Kingdom, England, whatever, it's not just England, but the United Kingdom, which for the 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century had been the world's leading empire and most developed and industrialized nation. And yet in 2020, with Brexit, the UK decided to leave the European Union, to go it on their own. to say, no, the UK first. And that has caused massive economic problems, social problems, political problems. The levels of poverty in the UK have skyrocketed to the point, I'm just going to read you this a little bit. This is a recent article in New York Review of Books, written by someone who has gone back and forth between the U.S. And he writes that, here we go. Where is this? Okay. In 2019, the United Nations Special Report on Extreme Poverty accused the UK government of the, quote, systematic immiseration of a significant part of the British population, end quote. 4 years later, his successor said that things have got worse and claimed the UK was in violation of international law over poverty levels. 29% of UK children live in poverty. 11.6% of all Americans live in poverty. And yet the wealthy keep getting wealthier. The billionaires keep getting more money. What do we do about it? And what impact does that have on our very understandings of who we are and how we should live within society? This new Cold War, is it really a Cold War over the common good and providing for citizens? Or is it this ideological struggle between quote unquote democracy and quote unquote autocracy? Democracy, the term, we'll be talking more about this later, is seen as a good. There are elections, supposedly quote unquote democratic, in many of these countries, though are led by autocratic or dictatorial rulers. What does it really mean? And what is at base the struggle between these two ideologies? And where is this struggle going to lead? Those are some of the questions facing us as we look to 2024. They're not the only ones, this struggle between, this ideological struggle between quote unquote the West and then China, Russia, North Korea, which we could call the East if we wanted. West and East. It also plays out, as it always had during the Cold War and even before, almost in a microcosm within the Middle East. Now, I've talked about the Middle East several times. I think I mentioned I'll be talking about it again. And part of your readings for this week are the Hamas Charter of 1988 and then the revised version of the Hamas Charter of 2017. We've talked about the problems of the Middle East after World War II, with the break, first of all, after World War I, with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, after World War II, after the Holocaust, with the creation in UN Resolution 181 of the state of Israel and then an Arab state within the region of Palestine. I think I've already pointed to the Arab Charter of 1945, seemingly to suggest that Palestine was not just a region, it was a state, it was an Arab state. And then in the founding document of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, we have very clearly there stated that this is it. We already have the as I think I mentioned, the justification of the invasion of Israel by Jordan, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, going back to 48, 49. That this territory they were claiming for Arabs, for Arabs living in the region of Palestine became the Palestinian Arabs, became the Palestinians. Hamas, the charter in 1988, is part of this radicalization that was going on within the Middle East, which we've seen again after the West imperial dictating of what was going to be going on in the Middle East and how to kind of divide it up. But it became increasingly radical, and Hamas became the radical faction, or one of the radical factions, supported by Iran, which had the Iranian Revolution, which we had talked about, that has as a platform the elimination of the State of Israel. They do not claim to be calling for the elimination of Jews anywhere and everywhere, even though we do see, as we've talked about, part of the platform is to basically kill Jews. And you'll see that in the Hamas Charter of 1988, which is removed from the Hamas Charter of 2017. To kill Jews, to eliminate Zionism, which is Israel, and to assert and proclaim Palestine as an Arab Islamic state. Now, we have the radical Zionists or radical Israelis, which is the current president of Israel, Netanyahu, and some of his supporters, who basically, not explicitly, but their policies indicate that what they're trying to do is remove all Arabs from Israel, which they consider to be basically most of Palestine. Whether we call it Israel, Palestine, the region remains the same. This has been a conflict, as I said, that has been going on since the end of World War II and has become radicalized. There are a lot of Israelis who want to live together. This two-state solution, which was the solution of UN Resolution 181 originally, to create a Jewish state and an Arab state. It's like, no, we can't have two. What do we do? How is that playing out in the world? And it's an issue, too, because the West, so to speak, U.S. and Europe, in general support Israel, and Russia, China, North Korea are supporting the Islamic Arabic territories. And it brings up the question of what is the relationship between politics and religion? Because even though we have in this country this idea that politics and religion are separate, the separation of church and state, has that really ever been the case? The non-establishment clause of the Constitution states that the government cannot establish a given religion. The government cannot proclaim a given religion as the religion of the territory, of the country. And that was in opposition to Britain. And the whole development from the colonists from 1609 on, leading to the Revolutionary War, people came to the New World to flee religious persecution in Britain. Because there we had the state church, the Church of England, and even Thomas Hobbes in the mid-17th century, as I talked about in the argument, argued that you can believe what you want, but you have to conform to the state religion. Whereas religion and politics are always the same. Even if in the United States, the government does not proclaim the Episcopalians, which was the American form of the Church of England, or the Presbyterians, or the Lutherans, or the Catholics, or the Baptists, or any other particular religious community as the official religion of the state. So there is a separation of church and state, so to speak, but is there a separation of religion and politics? And certainly not when there is an increasing faction of people, both explicitly and implicitly, who adhere to a position in a program of Christian nationalism. This idea that the United States is inherently a Christian country, not in any particular denomination, they will say, so that's not violating the separation of church and state, but basing their idea on the foundational principles of the United States as being fundamentally a Christian nation. And I've argued that that was certainly not the case for the Founding Fathers, and the whole issue of the Cold War in the 1950s, with the addition of "In God We Trust" as our motto, and adding "One Nation Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. This ideological conflict between the Christian West and the atheistic communist East. That's still going on. What is the relationship, what quote-unquote should be the relationship between politics and religion? Because what is going on in the Middle East, and that's why I've kind of focused on it a bit here in the past, is it's a microcosm of these broader worldwide global issues that confront Western civilization as what are your ideals? And if we uphold the ideals of the freedom of religion, which we do from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually from the U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence, foundational documents. What is the solution when we have one religion implicitly in conflict with another? How do we allow freedom of conscience to function when they conflict? If I say, based on my religious beliefs, you can't exist. Well, if you say, well, based on my religious beliefs, you can't exist. And if we have this sense of freedom of religion, how do we solve that problem politically? And it gets, that is the issue that gets on all different levels, not just that major one of, you don't have a right to exist, or you don't have a right to exist, but on all the kind of smaller levels that derive therefrom. Now, one of the things I argue and try to point out is, historically speaking, the myths going on in the Middle East of the Jewish version and the Islamic version, there's no historical basis for either of them. So how do we work out politically the historical developments combined with the religious understandings and interpretations of those developments? How do we work out within the United States the historical development together with current religious views of that development? Who has the right to do what? And when they conflict, how do we do it? And if we make it politics, if we make it policy, if we make it law, how can that be? But yet, if, in my view, my religious view, a given law contradicts my religious principles and views, is that not an infringement upon my religious rights? We hear a lot about religious freedom. Religious freedom, as it is discussed today in the popular discourse in politics, is simply my right to impose my religious views on everyone else. How do we handle that on the political national scale? Is there a solution? Is there a way out? I'm not saying that there is. I just want to point to the developments and the distinction between the myths and the historical developments. And as I've said all along, the myths, even though we said that's not the case, are real. Not in terms of a literal sense, but in terms of the impact, the beliefs. What we believe is the greatest historical factor that's ever been. How those beliefs lead to action, lead to politics, lead to international conflict. Can there be a way to base our beliefs on a solution to the conflict? And I'm not sure there is. That's what is looking at, and that's the way it's always been in so many ways. We're talking about these myths, and I'm talking about the overarching myths from the emergence of early modern Europe and the myth of the nation state out of the myth of Christendom that had been there before, based on the myth of Rome going all the way back to the myth of, we haven't gotten beyond the myth of the nation state yet, but we're in this period, this transition period from a modern paradigm to a postmodern paradigm, which is descriptive because we don't have really a grasp on what it is that is going on at the time in our current situation. How do we label it and describe it? We become so individualized that we see it only from our own perspective. You need to broaden out and say, okay, how do we deal with the whole thing, and what do we call ourselves, and what is going on here anyway? And that is why the Middle East is so important in terms of being a microcosm of the larger issue. The world economy within this context, in this ideological context, nevertheless, is very much intertwined to the point where can we really talk about a national economic system? Well, of course we can. We talk about the GNP and inflation and deflation and all these different things. But have we not developed to a situation in the world, unlike really ever before, or far more than ever before, where there's like a world economy in which there are individual parts, but it's all connected, at least for the most part. There are those countries on the periphery or on the margins that aren't really part of this world economic system, going back to what Emanuel Wallerstein referred to as the world system emerging in the course of the 16th century with the voyages of discovery and colonization. We think we've gone beyond colonization, but have we really? Or has it just changed forms? How do we understand how it all develops? And within this world economy, what's the relationship between politics and then money, wealth, and resources? Is it not the money that is driving politics? And this battle for money and resources, going back to some of the problems with the Middle East, the resource of oil. Why is it that, as I think I mentioned, it's been said, I forget who said it, but after World War II, the Middle East is the biggest prize in history because of the oil reserves. So there's fighting on the meta level as well as on the particular level over who has control of the resources. And this begins to question what really is going on here. What is the driving force of history, of politics on a global scale? Is it money and wealth and possession? Or is it values and ideals? And how do we navigate the two? And are there populations, are there political countries and states that are on the margins? And how do we deal with them who are not part of this world economic system? Or do we just not care unless it becomes kind of forced upon us to actually pay attention to these marginal countries? We used to talk about the third world countries. Second world, first world, okay, all based on industrialization, is that model. First world were the industrialized countries. The second world were industrializing countries, and the third world were the not yet industrialized countries. But if you look at it as this core and periphery, again, going back to Wallerstein's idea, core and periphery, the core being the nations with wealth and power, and who are fighting ideologically over the control of the world economy in so many ways. And then there are those states, populations that are on the margins that really don't have any say unless all of a sudden one of the big players becomes interested for one reason or another. What does it mean to be part of a world economic system? And does that fact itself not undermine the very concept of Western civilization? Asking the question again, what is then Western civilization? And this kind of then impinges upon or gets into the question for your final exam, which again we'll be talking more about next week. Because in some ways, the entire development of Western civilization, as we call it, during the chronological period of this course has been based on human rights and the understanding and developing understanding of what does it mean to be human. What is really humanity, and what does that mean? They're the individual in society and the danger of individualism. Where I talked about individualism in the postmodern world context, this new focus on me. What do I want? What do I want? Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? How are you going to vote based on your own self-interest? Beginning with Reagan, as distinct from John Kennedy's "Don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." This distinction between the individual good and the common good. What's that relationship? The sociologist Norbert Elias wrote a book called The I-We Balance. The book is called The Individuals in Society, but one of the major essays in there is The I-We Balance. Basically, he argues that there is no I without a we, because the I is defined in context of the we, whether it's a group, whether an individual family, a community, a city, a state, a country, a nation, or the world. But what is that balance or is there a conflict? And if the I, the individual, becomes the predominant basis for determining the decisions of the we, the commonality, is the common good even a concept, a theoretical idea that exists anymore with this new individualism? Because the whole point is individualism is in conflict with social good, social policies. And what are the effects of this focus on the individual, especially when the individual thinks what is good for me is what I want, and what is good for me is based on my own individual desires and ideas, and I want to have power and a say to protect those ideas. And how do I get that within the context of society? That is based on power, politics, and money. They have their ideals and values, power, politics, and money. These two opposing forces. What is the relationship between values and ideals on the one hand, and then power, politics, and money that all go together, that let's say are necessary for the realization or the pursuit of those ideals and values? They often come in conflict, and have we not gotten to a point where power, politics, and money themselves have become the only ideal and value of interest anymore? When we start using money as the measure of all value, where have we gotten? What does that say about Western civilization? This assertion of human rights has always attempted to argue for a fundamental ideal of humanity, the dignity of the human person, for all people, not just for individuals. And you say, well, not for all people, because as you pointed out repeatedly in your lectures, Declaration of Independence, going back to Locke too, from John Locke on, the whole tradition of human rights for quite a long time simply referred to the rights of free white males, propertied white males. Yes, indeed. But the concept is there in embryo, so to speak. It developed. And with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we saw after the end of World War II, the idea was that if we can focus on human rights, we can prevent international world warfare and conflict. Because again, we are all in this together. We're all human beings. And even though each human being is individual and unique, there's something common about humanity, about being human. That's that conflict. Being human or the individual good or the common good. How do those work? And if we value all of a sudden money as the indicator, then that means that we only have value based on how much money we have or how much money we make. And we can throw away the entire basis of Western values and ideals. Have we gotten to that position? In 1966, this is some 18 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN, in another resolution, adopted the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. This is also a document assigned for your reading for this week, and I want you to read it and think about it. What does it mean? It was adopted by the UN. I forget the exact numbers. You can look them up if you just Google the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. You'll see for the UN page where there's a distinction between those countries that have signed the agreement and those who have ratified it. The United States has not ratified it. It's like, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to state that we are on the international level going to uphold and support and defend the statement of social, economic, and cultural rights. We at least give lip service to doing so with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but this goes far too far. If we uphold the ideals of human rights, what does that really entail? Because if we all of a sudden say, no, we're not going to do that, what do we end up with? And it causes the question of, if we're not going to base our policies, our ideals, our hopes, our aspirations on human rights, what's the point? Okay, so they're not perfectly recognized, but is it not the goal that we should be working toward? Read that International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. Think about it. And what's the basis of rights? And if we're not even attempting to follow it, if we are opting out and saying, no, we're not going to follow these global agreements because we are exceptional. We are the United States. We're going to go our own way. That's just simply, again, the I-we balance. So it's not so much we as part of the global human community. It is, no, I am what is of concern. I am what is of interest. This whole social common good as opposed to individual good and individual rights opposed to common rights plays out on that larger level, not just individual me in a country, but individual countries within the global community. And when I pointed to the U.S., that's not to say that other countries are all on board either, because we all do this. The U.S. is not the only country who does not follow the dictates or give legitimacy to the dictates of the International Court of Human Rights or the International Court of Justice when they are on the condemnation side of things, even though they will use it to condemn their people. So human rights becomes not an issue of, yes, this is a principle that we follow, but simply this is another tool that we can use to assert our own power and authority. And if that's the case, where are we in terms of what are human rights and where do they come from anyway? Is it simply not simply, again, other instruments of control and power? And if we have lost the realization that there are such things as human rights, except as tools of power and wealth and influence and authority, what does that say about being human? If there's an end to human rights, is there an end to humanity? Are we in a post-human world? Yes, okay, you can say we're still human, ha ha ha. We're not all clones yet. We're not all robots yet, drones or whatever. So we're still not in a post-human world. But if we do not recognize and value and uphold that which makes us human, not simply as biological, physical specimens, but what does it mean to be human? And if we deny human rights or ignore human rights for all, aren't we moving towards a post-human world in terms of humanity? Even if biologically we'll still be around for a little while anyway. It's a difficult question, almost like this Huxley's dystopia, Brave New World, actually in the process of becoming a reality, even not as he described and forecasts. And this gets all to the question, too, of in this context, who or what is really calling the shots? Who is in control? Who has the influence to make the decisions in terms of human rights, in terms of national policy, in terms of global policy? We say the UN as the international instrument of government that we all had agreed to adhere to and to support? Or is it still the nation state? Or is the nation state something that is in the last throes of its existence too? You say, well, no, the United States is going to be around for a lot more. Russia will be around for more. Yes, okay. But are they really in charge? And I have up here the multinational corporations. Once we shift to the influence on money and wealth as the basis of power and politics and policy and value, the wealth of these multinational corporations becomes increasingly important. We can't allow them to fail. And the nation state almost becomes a pawn of the multinational corporations. What does that mean for our understanding of the nation state? What does that mean for our politics, even in the United States? Think of the influence of wealth on our politics. When you go to vote, Are your ideas formed by a reflection on what is best for the country? Are they based on even your reflections on what you feel is in your own best self-interest? Or are they based on what you've been told is your best interest, and what you've been told is how you should vote? It goes both ways, but the influence of money is huge. Does money buy elections? Or do people have the quote-unquote freedom to make their own decisions? How are decisions affected and influenced and developed? It's always been a problem. I have up there then too the disinformation and post-truth era, because so much of the problems informing public opinion, informing individual opinion, is the media. And I'm not just talking about what's on television and even going to social media and things, but the context that we receive our information and understanding of our world. And in the development of these multinational companies focused on media, just like you can say the big oil companies, Exxon has an inordinate influence on the politics of our country. We could also say the social media companies, which are also huge multinational corporations, do so as well. Just think of what they could do if they started to threaten. If they said, okay, we're going to just cut off the internet. Sorry, you do what we want, or we're going to get rid of this. There is power and there is compromise that we have to appease them, so to speak. And then they're in control of the information we receive. That allows for disinformation, for the manipulation of what is produced out there, what is broadcast out there, this all comes back to advertising in some ways, because it's the same issue. Buy our product. Why? Because it's better. Oh, really? It's an attempt to shape public opinion. The Nazis under Hitler were brilliant at this. I think I mentioned, Goebbels' platform of social media and propaganda, but it goes all the way back to Rome. In my 113 class, I talk about the Rome and the myth of Rome and the Augustan Revolution with Caesar Augustus was really the first mass media attempt at propaganda to shape and form public opinion consciously, politically, strategically, and that's just developed all the way through. But what does it mean that these companies have so much control? What does it mean that we are so addicted to our machine, to social media? It's completely transformed society in a way that was not possible even 50 years ago. It's a very new development. And if we have this control of multinational corporations and multinational media corporations leading to disinformation in what has been called the post-truth era, what's the basis of getting back to anything that we can agree upon? Post-truth. Oh my gosh. That is such a slap in the face to the entire Western tradition. If I say vanilla ice cream is the best ice cream in the world, if you say no, chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream in the world, we cannot ever solve that conflict unless I can persuade you or force you, or vice versa. We've gotten into this realm of arguing about opinions, beliefs, and tastes, and not focus on what is real that we can analyze. It's not just my interpretation. That's always been an issue, conflicting interpretations. It's what are we interpreting? That is even no longer the basis, because we can't agree on what is being interpreted. We're just looking at my interpretation, your interpretation, my interpretation, your interpretation, and not looking at what is real. It'd be as if to doctors, or if I went to a doctor and the doctor said, "Oh, you have cancer, you have lung cancer." Oh, I want a second opinion. So I go to another doctor, and that doctor says, "No, you don't have lung cancer. Your lungs are just fine." Two competing positions, two competing interpretations. Which one is right? Well, if those two doctors got together and argued, one could say, "No, he has lung cancer." The other one, "No, his lungs are fine." What's the basis for solving that conflict? It'd be my lungs. Let's examine my lungs. Now, there could be discrepancies over what is the really state of my lungs, how far has it progressed in development, because that's looking at the actual physical thing that we can talk about. But if we no longer talk about that physical thing, that basis, and simply talk about different interpretations, mine's as equally valid as yours is, where are we? Nowhere. And that means that the whole Western tradition has been moved beyond, and therefore is not the nation state, no longer really a concept that has much of an influence anymore, except as a myth of the way things had been. And who's calling the shots? Those who are controlling and in charge of money and information. How do we get beyond that? What do we really do? And is Western civilization itself a myth that has developed to the point that it's meeting its own demise and having to confront that? We have to ask the question, then, what is the West anyway? And what is civilization? Those are questions that I really focus on in the first part of this course, Western Civilization 1, H113, but it's as valid for Western Civilization 2, our course. And at the end of it, we need to ask, what is the West? It's not a geographical designation. It'd be very difficult to make that argument, because West is relative to where you are. It's relative to your own point of observation. Russia is west of China. China is west of California. So is China the West? Is Korea the West? Well, if you're standing in California, yes, because you have to travel west to get there. It all depends on your perspective and point of reference. In some ways, civilization also is a problematic term of how do we define it. One basic definition is life in cities, from the Latin civis, civilis, and that leads to the citizens and the citizens of a nation, of a state. But what we're really getting at here is ideologies. And I think I described all ideologies, if I didn't, I should have, not as skewed understandings. That was the Marxist view, Engels, the history of ideology, I forgot exactly what it's called, the ideology. But viewed as skewed knowledge or understanding. All of our understandings are skewed. We're all biased. We all have our ideologies. It's not a bad word. It's not a dirty word. It's not simply something that our opponents are ideological. We're just looking at the truth. Ideology, as the term originated in the 18th century by French scholar de Tracy, simply meant the history of ideas. Ideology is the study of the history of ideas. The effect and impact of ideas. And ideas are formed in many different ways. Very complex. And that's why I've said before, the history is the most complex discipline you can ever study, because it deals with human beings and why we do what we do. And that's difficult because it's so complex. How do our ideas form? And then do we act according to our ideas or not? Do we act according to our ideals? And what's the difference between ideals and ideas? And where are values in all of this? How do we determine that which is good to do, either for our own self-interest or for the common good? And why is self-interest better than the common good? Why is the common good better than individual good? What is that all based on? And what is behind those concepts and ideas? How do we analyze it and deal with it? Or do we just say, oh, it doesn't matter, we're just going to go our own way anyway? It's not a problem with ideologies that we can ever get beyond them. But we can at least strive to understand their impact and development and what are the forces that create them as we go forward in history. One of the defining characteristics of Western civilization has always been the understanding of these ideas and a way of thinking about them, namely the Western philosophical tradition and the Western tradition of education and the liberal arts. Because the liberal arts teach values, not what to think, but how to think about these issues. The liberal arts, 7 liberal arts coming out of the classical tradition. Then we talk about more liberal arts. And what's happening with liberal arts? They're falling by the wayside. They're being devalued. STEM is most important because STEM leads to good paying jobs. Oh, a liberal arts major. What are you going to do with that? Now, actually, liberal arts majors are very employable. But there are issues and problems and perceptions and what it is that we are teaching as part of this ongoing social indoctrination program, because that's what it all is, from kindergarten all the way through, or even preschool through university. This is a public institution. It's maybe not as explicit as earlier on, but it's still there in terms of the policies of why is this a good? Why is this a public good that we should spend our taxpayer dollars on? Public education, public universities. We need to train a workforce. Why? To make money. Why? For us. Why? So we can flourish. Why? So we can have power and wealth. How do we manage this? And if we devalue the liberal arts in the name of money and power, if we try to reduce the liberal arts to skills, what can you do? I can write a grammatically correct sentence. Oh, can you anymore? Who determines what is grammatically correct? Those are all the problems and issues involved that if we just say those don't matter anymore because they don't allow one to monetize them, where have we gone? What have we done? And is this not facing the whole demise of Western civilization itself and our governing and attempts to govern ourselves? Now, there's something you might think that's kind of weird, isn't it? Polybius' Cycle of Constitutions, which was expressed or published in his works. Polybius was a Greek historian writing within the context of the Roman Empire. And his works came out prior to 118 BCE when he dies. I just want to call attention to this because you will see, I think, why. Because it's based on Aristotle. Aristotle dies in 399 BCE. Put to death for undermining the public good, for corrupting the youth, because he asked questions. Why should we follow the government? Why should we do things this way? What is justice? Oh, those questions are threatening. They're undermining. They're radical. We need to stop questioning. But in his politics, Aristotle is looking at the development of states. He says, when we look at government and the different forms of government, there are 3 good forms of government and then 3 corrupt forms of government. We have monarchy. They're the common good and individual good, because that's the distinction between the good forms and the corrupt forms. Monarchy is the rule of one for the good of all. Aristocracy is the rule of a few for the good of all. And polity is rule of the many for the good of all. Those each have corrupt forms. The corrupt form of monarchy is tyranny, which Aristotle defined as the rule of one for their own good, for its own good. Aristocracy, the corrupt form, is oligarchy, which Aristotle defines as the rule of the few for their own good. And then there is democracy, which translates as mob rule, which is the rule of the many for their own individual good. Now, Polybius came along and said, yeah, okay, I get that. I see that. But you know what? What we find is these are not just good forms and bad forms, but there's a cycle that is involved. So we have here monarchy then deforms into tyranny, whereby then a few rise up to overthrow the tyrant to establish autocracy, or aristocracy. But over time, aristocracy is corrupted so they start ruling for their own interests rather than for the good of all, and aristocracy becomes and devolves into oligarchy, which is a corrupt form of government, whereby then a larger majority of the citizens, not all the inhabitants, but the citizens, going back to the Greek understanding of polity, rise up to rid the state of oligarchy. They establish polity, the rule of many for the good of all. So it's not the rule of all. But polity devolves then into democracy, which is mob rule. Whereas it is not just a polity, but it is everyone having a say for themselves. As a corrupt form of polity, which then leads eventually to a strong ruler rising up again to bring order to the chaos and establishes monarchy once again, the rule of one for the good of all, which devolves into tyranny, and on it goes. The question then is, does this cycle fit what we see in the historical development? In some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. In some ways in a very general sense maybe, but in a particular sense not really. There's a brilliant insight into Polybius, analyzing how these forms work, and are there good forms and bad forms, and how are good forms of government and bad forms of government defined for the good of their citizens and all, for the good of the few, the wealthy. How do we define this, and where are we on this cycle today in the United States, in the world? Where is Britain on this? Where is France? Where is Germany? Where is Russia? Where is China, North Korea? Are we in the state of polity? What we call, because we think democracy is a positive. We think democracy is actually what we think of as democracy is actually polity. Because democracy, one person, one vote, in the Greek sense, that's mob rule. That's the tyranny of the majority. How is that a good form of government? How is that going to bring prosperity and wealth and happiness? Not in the sense of pleasure, oh, I'm happy right now, but in the sense of living a valued life. Living a life that is in keeping with being human, or our understandings of it. As that concept has developed in the course of the early modern period, the modern period normally go based on individual rights and human rights. What does it all mean? How do we deal with these issues? I'm not sure. I can't answer that. It can't be predicted in the future. We can say, well, are we going right from mob rule back to tyranny? Or are we going to go back to monarchy? Or maybe we are on polity and we're going to skip from polity to tyranny? Or are we going to go back to aristocracy? How can we deal with this? And then the question is, aren't we already in aristocracy? When we, or if not an oligarchy, when we have the influence of this individual good, of individualism, trying to use policy for my own individual enrichment and wealth. And the influence of money, the influence of it, as the only value that has any force anymore. Whereby if I'm wealthy, I am by definition better than those who are less wealthy than I am. What does that mean for the Western tradition? What does that mean for our understanding of history? Because it's not what we're seeing here in terms of Western civilization, the potential end of Western civilization, a development, historical development, whereby the historical development itself undermines the history itself. Meaning we are no longer aware of the history of the West. And without that concept, without that understanding, without that asking, who are we anyway? Whether we're Americans or Russians or Chinese, and what is the basis for that identity? Because memory is identity of individuals and of states and of the world. Who are we? And if we lose our identity, if we lose our memory, we lose our identity. And that means if we lose our memory, we lose our history. If we lose our history, we lose our memory and therefore our identity. And then how do we go from there? How do we move into a world where we don't really know what we're doing because we don't even know who we are? Look back and say, oh, the Western tradition is bad. Or we can say, oh, the Western tradition is good. We should move back to that golden period. Or no, we should damn it and move forward. But both sides don't really know what they're talking about. Both sides are simply, in that sense, trying to use and manipulate the memory and the history for their own individual good in the present. What do we do about this? I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. But these perspectives, this reflection, as we move into our own new, brave new world, is why I feel this course is so important. It's why I feel the liberal arts are so important. Because they don't teach us what to think, or they shouldn't teach us what to think, but they should teach us how to think. How to think and reflect on who we are, where are we going, how did we get here, and on what basis do we make those determinations. That's what this is all about. And that is my answer to the so what question. I hope this course has allowed you to ask some of these questions for yourselves. But that's not what I'm going to be asking you to do in your exam. Whether you reflect on this reflection or on any of the other lectures or course material of this course, if you don't have the experience of any of this causing you to stop and think and say, whoa, why, wow, maybe I should think differently, or why did I think this way? You still have to answer the question based on the assigned course material. I'll be talking more about that in the next lecture as we prepare for the final examination. But I hope you have gotten a lot out of this course. I know after this lecture you have to focus on the practicalities of writing the final. I appreciate that, but after you submit your final, I hope you will at some point reflect back on this course and ask yourself, did it make any difference to me? Do I view myself any differently? Do I view the world any differently? Do I view our situation any differently? Do I view how I make decisions? Do I view what it means to be human any differently? That is a real value for me on this course, but as I said all along, that's not something I'm going to grade. I exhort you to read the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to read the documents that I've assigned. They're part of the course material, but they also, I think, cause us to question, say, how does this relate to the situation we find ourselves in? Or is it simply a nice document that if we are wealthy enough, we can use as lip service, but it doesn't really matter? Western civilization. It's important to reflect on how we've gotten to be where we are today as individuals and as states, nations, and human beings on a global scale. Thank you very much.